My name is Ibrahim Traoré. I serve as the president of Burkina Faso. I was not born into wealth or power. I grew up in a country where people wake before sunrise to work the land, where families pray before meals, and where faith is often the only certainty people have. In Burkina Faso, belief in God is not an abstract idea. It is woven into everyday life. Mothers whisper prayers over their children before school. Farmers lift their eyes to heaven when the rains delay. Soldiers carry small Bibles in their bags. I was raised in that same spirit. Long before politics ever entered my life, I learned that leadership begins with responsibility. Responsibility to your people. Responsibility to truth. Responsibility before God. When the events of September 30th, 2022 changed the course of our nation, I did not see power as victory. I saw it as a burden placed upon my shoulders. Our country had endured years of instability. Security challenges were growing. Communities felt abandoned. Many people believed the future of Burkina Faso was slipping away. When I assumed leadership after the coup d'etat, I understood something very clearly. A nation cannot rebuild itself if its foundations are weak. Security was one foundation, unity was another. But there was also something deeper, something quieter that few people were discussing openly. Debt. At first, it appeared only as numbers in reports, columns of figures inside economic documents sent by ministries and international institutions. The numbers tell stories. Sometimes those stories are hidden. During my first months in office, I began receiving briefings from economic advisors. They spoke about infrastructure projects, development programs, financial partnerships, and international cooperation. Many of those projects were funded through loans. Loans from international financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. At first glance, these arrangements appeared normal. Many developing nations rely on international loans to build roads, energy systems, and public services. But the more I listened, the more I noticed something troubling. The total amount of international debt carried by Burkina Faso had been rising steadily over the past decade. It was not a sudden increase. It was gradual, almost silent. In 2010, our total international debt was around $3.2 billion. By 2025, that number had reached roughly $9.4 billion, nearly 3 times higher. Some advisors explained that this growth was expected. They said it reflected development efforts. They said loans allowed us to accelerate progress. Perhaps they were right. But something in my spirit was unsettled. When a country borrows, it hopes the borrowed money will create growth. That growth should strengthen the economy enough to repay the loan without weakening the nation. But what happens when repayment begins to consume the very resources meant to build the future? That question began to stay with me. At first, it was only a quiet concern. Then reports began to arrive showing delays in several infrastructure projects funded by international loans. Some projects were progressing slowly, others were facing cost increases, and some had barely begun despite significant funds already being committed. I asked for more information. More documents, more financial summaries. The answers I received were technical, complicated, and filled with economic language that could easily make a person stop asking questions. But I kept asking, because leadership requires looking beyond the surface, and sometimes truth appears in unexpected moments. For me, that moment came in the early hours of a March morning in 2026. It came during prayer. It came while reading a passage from the book of Proverbs. A simple line that many believers have read countless times. The borrower is servant to the lender. Those words stopped me. They echoed in my mind long after I closed the Bible. And in that quiet moment, I began to look at the financial path of my country in a completely different way. What began as a concern soon became a decision that would lead to an emergency meeting in Ouagadougou. A decision to review every major international loan agreement signed over the past 2 decades. A decision that would reveal uncomfortable truths, and perhaps, if God allowed it, a chance to guide Burkina Faso toward a more independent future. But before any of that happened, there were signs. Small signs that had been building for many years. Signs hidden inside numbers. Signs that most people never noticed. The first sign appeared long before I became president, and understanding it requires going back in time. Back to the year 2010. Back to the beginning of a financial story that would shape the destiny of my nation. When people speak about the future of a nation, they often talk about roads, schools, hospitals, and electricity. These are visible signs of progress. But behind every visible structure, there is usually something invisible holding it up. Money. And in many countries, that money often comes from loans. For many years, Burkina Faso followed a path that seemed common among developing nations. International financial institutions offered funding for infrastructure, energy development, transportation networks, and other projects designed to modernize the country. On paper, these partnerships promised growth. When I first began reviewing economic reports after becoming president, I noticed something that at first looked ordinary. Burkina Faso's international debt had grown over time. That by itself was not unusual. Many countries borrow money to invest in development. Loans can help build roads faster, improve energy supply, and support economic expansion. But numbers carry meaning when you study them carefully. In 2010, Burkina Faso's total external debt stood at approximately $3.2 billion. At the time, the economy was smaller, and the government believed these loans would help strengthen national infrastructure. Some funds were directed toward energy projects intended to improve electricity supply. Others supported road construction that would connect remote regions to markets and cities. There were also agreements connected to agricultural development and mining infrastructure. These initiatives sounded promising, and many citizens welcomed them. After all, improved roads allow farmers to bring crops to market more easily. Reliable electricity allows businesses to grow. Infrastructure can lift communities out of poverty. But the story did not end there. Year after year, new agreements were signed. Some loans were relatively small. Others were larger packages tied to development programs or financial assistance. At each stage, the reasoning appeared logical. Development requires investment. Investment sometimes requires borrowing. Yet something important was happening beneath the surface. The total amount of international debt was rising faster than many people realized. By 2015, the numbers had grown noticeably higher. By 2020, the debt level had climbed further. Then by 2025, the total international debt carried by Burkina Faso had reached roughly $9.4 billion, nearly triple the amount recorded 15 years earlier. When you look at numbers like that, it is easy to become distracted by scale. Billions can seem abstract. But when you bring those figures down to the level of ordinary people, the picture changes. Debt is not just an economic statistic. Debt influences national decisions. Debt shapes government budgets. Debt determines how much money a country can spend on healthcare, education, security, and social programs. If too much revenue is required to repay loans, less remains for the daily needs of citizens. At first, these changes were gradual. Budget allocations shifted slowly. Repayments increased little by little. Many leaders before me believed the loans would eventually pay for themselves through economic growth. Perhaps some of them truly believed that. Perhaps some projects genuinely aim to improve the country. But development is not only about borrowing money, it is also about ensuring that borrowed money produces real results. And that is where questions began to appear. During several economic briefings, I asked my advisors about the progress of certain infrastructure projects funded through international loans. Some responses were encouraging, but others were uncertain. There were delays in certain construction programs. Some transportation projects had taken longer than expected. In a few cases, costs had increased beyond the original estimates. These issues were often explained as technical complications, weather delays, supply shortages, administrative procedures. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own, but when I stepped back and looked at the overall pattern, I felt a growing unease. The debt was rising, the projects were moving slowly, and the future financial obligations of the nation were becoming heavier. Still, I did not immediately draw conclusions. Leadership requires patience. It requires listening before speaking. So I continued gathering information. More reports arrived from economic ministries, financial summaries from government agencies, reviews of international agreements signed over previous administrations. Each document added another piece to the puzzle. Some loans were tied to energy production, others to road networks, some related to mining infrastructure intended to help Burkina Faso benefit from its natural resources. In theory, these investments should strengthen the national economy, but development loans carry another reality. They must be repaid, not only the original borrowed amount, but also interest. And repayment schedules rarely wait for projects to succeed or fail. The obligation exists regardless of outcomes. One evening, after reviewing several financial summaries, I found myself thinking about something very simple. What happens when a nation's debt grows faster than its ability to repay it? What happens when a country becomes dependent on continuous borrowing simply to maintain development programs? That question lingered in my mind. At that time, I still did not know how important that question would become, because the true weight of the problem would reveal itself during a meeting in Ouagadougou, a meeting that would take place on March 10, 2026. a meeting where my advisors would present a financial reality that could no longer be ignored. And it was during that meeting that one number would stand out above all others. A number that would force me to look at our national debt in an entirely new way. A number that would lead me into a night of prayer. And ultimately, to a decision that could shape the economic future of Burkina Faso. But before that night of prayer came the meeting. An urgent meeting. One that began as a financial briefing and ended as a turning point. The morning of March 10th, 2026 began like many others in Ouagadougou. The city slowly came to life under the soft light of sunrise. Motorbikes moved through dusty streets. Market vendors arranged their goods. Children walked to school carrying small bags on their backs. But inside the presidential offices, the atmosphere was different. I had asked for an urgent economic briefing the night before. The reports I have been reviewing over the previous weeks left too many unanswered questions. I wanted clarity. I wanted to understand the full picture of Burkina Faso's financial position, not fragments, the whole truth. So that morning I gathered several of the country's senior economic advisors, members of the finance ministry, and representatives from the military leadership. The meeting took place in Ouagadougou, inside a secure conference room where important national discussions often happen. The room itself was quiet and simple. A long wooden table stood in the center. Documents were placed neatly in front of each seat. Several screens were prepared for financial presentations. One by one, the participants arrived. Some greeted each other softly, others sat in silence, reviewing their papers. When everyone had taken their seats, the briefing began. An economic advisor stood and began presenting the country's current financial overview. The presentation started with familiar numbers, national revenue, government expenditures, projected growth rates. At first, everything sounded like the typical language of economic reports. Technical, structured, distant. But as the presentation continued, the focus shifted to government obligations, specifically debt repayment. Charts appeared on the screen showing how much Burkina Faso had borrowed from various international financial institutions over the years. Lines moved upward across the graphs, illustrating the steady increase in total external debt. I had already seen similar charts before, but that day, I asked them to go deeper. Show me the real pressure, I said. Show me what this means for our budget. The advisor nodded and turned to the next slide. And that was when the room became very quiet. A table appeared showing the distribution of government spending for the year 2025. Education, healthcare, security, infrastructure, agriculture, and debt repayment. The number beside debt repayment caught my attention immediately. Approximately 38% of the national budget, 38%. Nearly 2/5 of the entire government budget was being used to repay loans and interest. For a moment, no one spoke. I leaned forward slightly in my chair and asked a simple question. Are these numbers correct? The advisor nodded slowly. Yes, Mr. President. He explained that the figure included both principal repayments and interest obligations tied to international loans signed over many years. Some agreements dated back more than a decade. Others were more recent. But together, they formed a heavy financial obligation, 38%. That meant that out of every 100 units of government revenue, 38 were already committed to debt payments before the country could even begin funding public services. It meant that hospitals, schools, infrastructure, and security programs had to share the remaining portion. In other words, the future of our nation was already partially pledged to the past. The discussion that followed lasted for hours. We examined multiple financial reports. The advisors explained repayment schedules stretching many years into the future. They described the interest structures tied to various loans. Some loans had favorable conditions, others carried more demanding repayment terms. But what troubled me most was not a single contract. It was the overall pattern. Burkina Faso had accumulated a large number of financial agreements with international lenders. Each one may have seemed manageable when viewed individually, but together, they created a system of obligations that placed increasing pressure on the national budget. I asked several questions that morning. Which projects were funded by these loans? Were they completed on time? Had they generated the economic growth originally predicted? Some answers were encouraging, others were uncertain, and some questions required further investigation. One advisor admitted that certain infrastructure projects had faced delays, another mentioned that cost overruns had occurred in some development programs. Still, no one suggested there was an intentional problem. The explanation remained the same. Development takes time. Challenges occur. Economic growth will eventually balance the debt. Yet something inside me remained unsettled. Not angry, Not suspicious, just uneasy, because numbers tell stories. And the story those numbers were telling was simple. Burkina Faso had been borrowing steadily for many years. Now repayment was consuming a significant portion of the national budget. The meeting continued well into the afternoon. By the end of the discussion, one thing was clear. We needed a deeper review, not just of the numbers, but of the agreements themselves, which contracts had been signed, what conditions they contained, how the funds had been used, and whether the long-term impact truly benefited the people of Burkina Faso. I asked the advisors to prepare more detailed reports. They agreed, but as the meeting ended and people slowly left the room, the weight of the situation remained in my mind. 38%. That number stayed with me throughout the rest of the day. Later that evening, after the meetings were finished and the city had grown quiet, I returned to my residence. Sometimes leadership leaves a person with questions that statistics alone cannot answer. That night was one of those moments. I felt the need for silence, for reflection, for prayer. I opened my Bible, not searching for economic guidance, just seeking peace. But what I read that night would lead to something far more powerful than I expected. A simple verse, one sentence from the book of Proverbs, words that many believers know well. Yet that night they felt different, because suddenly they were no longer just spiritual wisdom. They were a warning about debt, and a reminder about freedom. That night, after the long meeting in Ouagadougou, the city slowly fell into silence. Most people had returned to their homes. The streets outside my residence had grown quiet. Only the distant hum of motorcycles and the occasional barking of dogs broke the stillness. Leadership often brings moments like this. During the day, you are surrounded by advisors, documents, decisions, and responsibilities. But at night, when everything becomes quiet, you are left alone with your thoughts. And sometimes, those quiet hours reveal truths that the noise of the day hides. I remember sitting alone in a small room where I often go to pray. There was nothing extraordinary about the setting, a simple wooden chair, a small table, my Bible resting beside a glass of water. The soft glow of a lamp illuminated the pages. I had come there not as a president, but as a believer. When I pray, I do not speak as a head of state. I speak as a man who understands that human wisdom has limits. And sometimes we need guidance beyond numbers and reports. The financial meeting from earlier that day was still on my mind. 38% of the national budget devoted to debt repayment. That number had followed me all evening. I kept asking myself the same question. Was this truly the path toward development? Or had our country slowly entered something we did not fully understand? I opened the Bible without any particular plan. For many believers, reading scripture is not always about searching for answers to specific problems. Sometimes it is simply about reflection, about reconnecting with faith. I turned to the book of Proverbs. This part of the Bible is known for its wisdom about life, responsibility, and the consequences of choices. Many of its verses are short, simple, but powerful. As I read quietly, one line caught my attention, a sentence I had seen before. Yet that night it felt different. The borrower is servant to the lender. I stopped reading. I looked at the page again. The borrower is servant to the lender. The sentence was not complicated. It did not contain complex theological ideas, but the meaning was unmistakable. Debt creates dependence. When someone borrows, they place themselves in a position where another party holds influence over their future. For individuals, this lesson is straightforward. But for nations, the consequences can be enormous. I sat there for several minutes, reflecting on those words. Earlier that day, I had learned that Burkina Faso was dedicating 38% of its national budget to repaying international loans. 38%. And suddenly the verse from Proverbs began echoing in my mind. The borrower is servant to the lender. Was our nation becoming financially dependent in ways we had not fully recognized? Had decades of development loans slowly created obligations that limited our economic freedom? These were not accusations. They were questions, but they were questions that demanded honest answers. I continued reading for a while, but my mind kept returning to that single verse. The borrower is servant to the lender. Faith does not replace economic analysis. Scripture does not automatically solve financial challenges, but sometimes faith gives us clarity. It helps us step back and see the larger picture. That night, I began to look at our national debt not only as numbers on a balance sheet, but as relationships. Every loan creates a relationship between borrower and lender. Some relationships are fair and balanced. Others gradually shift power toward one side. If a nation becomes too dependent on external loans, its ability to make independent decisions can weaken. And independence matters, especially for countries that have spent generations struggling to protect their sovereignty. Burkina Faso is part of a continent that knows this history very well. Africa has experienced many forms of external control throughout history. Political control, economic influence, resource extraction. Because of this history, the question of financial independence is not abstract. It is deeply connected to dignity, to sovereignty, to the ability of a nation to determine its own future. As I reflected on these ideas, I realized something important. The question was not whether borrowing was good or bad. Many countries borrow money responsibly and benefit from it. The real question was whether Burkina Faso fully understood the long-term structure of the financial agreements it had entered. Had we carefully evaluated every condition? Had we examined how these loans would affect future generations? Or had we simply continued borrowing because it seemed like the easiest path to development? That night, in the quiet hours before dawn, I made a decision. Not a political declaration, not a speech, just a decision to search for truth. If our country was carrying billions of dollars in international debt, then we needed to understand every agreement connected to that debt. Every contract, every condition, every repayment structure, not in fragments, but completely. I closed the Bible and sat in silence for a few minutes. Then I stood up and wrote down a simple instruction. The government would establish an independent financial review. A team of economic experts would examine every major international loan agreement signed by Burkina Faso over the past 2 decades. No assumptions, no shortcuts, just facts. Because leadership sometimes begins with a question, but it must continue with action. And by the time the sun rose over Ouagadougou that morning, I already knew what the next step would be. The government would form a financial audit team, a group of specialists who would carefully review every international loan agreement signed between 2005 and 2025. Their mission would be simple: to understand exactly what commitments our nation had made, and to determine whether those commitments truly served the long-term interests of the people of Burkina Faso. That decision would begin later that same morning, and it would set in motion a process that would reveal more than anyone expected. The formation of the financial audit team, morning of March 10th, 2026. When the sun rose over Ouagadougou that morning, the city slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Markets opened, government offices prepared for the day, motorbikes filled the streets again. For most people, March 10th, 2026 looked like any other ordinary day. But inside the presidential office, something important was about to begin. The decision I had made during the early hours of prayer was no longer just a personal reflection. It needed to become a national action. Faith may inspire clarity, but leadership requires structure. So that morning I called for another meeting. Not as large as the financial briefing from the previous day. This meeting was more focused. Only a small group of senior government officials attended, along with several respected economic specialists who had experience in public finance, auditing, and international economic agreements. The atmosphere in the room was serious but calm. I began the meeting by explaining the concern that had been growing in my mind over the previous weeks. I spoke about the rising national debt. I spoke about the 38% of the budget being used to repay loans. And I spoke about the need to fully understand the financial agreements Burkina Faso had entered over the years. No accusations, no dramatic statements, just a simple principle. If a country carries billions of dollars in international debt, then its leaders must understand exactly how that debt was created, and whether the agreements behind it truly benefit the people. I then announced the next step. The government of Burkina Faso would establish a financial audit team. Its task would be to review all major international loan agreements signed between 2005 and 2025. 20 years of financial commitments. Every agreement would be examined carefully, not with hostility, not with suspicion, but with transparency, because understanding the truth should never be seen as an act of conflict. It is simply an act of responsibility. After presenting this decision, I asked the advisors to help assemble the right group of experts. The team needed to be competent, independent in their thinking, and experienced in economic analysis. Within a short period of discussion, we identified several economists, financial analysts, and government auditors who had the expertise required for such a task. In total, the audit team would consist of 21 specialists. Each of them brought different skills. Some had worked within government ministries. Others had experience analyzing international development projects. A few had studied economic systems abroad and understood the complexities of global financial institutions. Together, they formed a balanced team, capable of examining complex agreements. Once the group was confirmed, I gave them a clear mission. Their objective was not to produce political arguments. Their objective was to produce facts. They would review each international loan agreement signed by Burkina Faso during the 20-year period. They would examine the financial terms, the repayment structures, the interest conditions, the projects linked to those loans, and the actual outcomes of those projects. Did the infrastructure get built? Did the energy programs improve electricity supply? Did the transportation networks increase trade and economic activity? Or had some projects failed to deliver the expected benefits? These were the questions the audit team needed to answer. I also asked them to evaluate whether the overall debt structure placed excessive pressure on the national budget, not just today, but in the years ahead, because the most dangerous financial problems are often the ones that grow slowly over time. A debt obligation that appears manageable today may become difficult 10 years later, especially if the economy grows more slowly than expected. The team accepted the responsibility. I could see both determination and concern on their faces. They understood the importance of their task. Examining 2 decades of financial agreements would not be simple. Some contracts were long and complicated. Many involved multiple institutions, development programs, and technical conditions. But the team also understood that their work could shape the economic future of Burkina Faso. Before the meeting ended, I made one more request. I asked them to conduct their work with integrity. No shortcuts, no political pressure, only careful analysis. The truth must come from evidence, not opinion. They agreed. Within hours, the audit team began organizing their work. Government ministries were instructed to provide access to financial documents. Loan contracts were gathered. Development project records were compiled. Financial reports from past administrations were retrieved from archives. The process of reviewing 2 decades of economic decisions had begun. Over the following days, the 21 specialists would examine dozens of loan agreements connected to energy programs, transportation projects, mining infrastructure, and national development plans. At that moment, none of us knew exactly what they would find. Perhaps the agreements would prove sound and beneficial. Perhaps the rising debt was simply the natural cost of modernization. Or perhaps there were deeper problems hidden within the contracts. We would only know after the review was completed. But one thing was certain. For the first time, Burkina Faso was taking a comprehensive look at the financial path it had followed for 20 years. And that review would soon focus on a specific number. A number that represented the scale of our commitments. 52. 52 international loan agreements. Each one tied to a project. Each one tied to a repayment obligation. Each one shaping the economic future of our country. Understanding those 52 agreements would become the next step in uncovering the full picture. And that process would reveal patterns no one had fully recognized before. In the days that followed the formation of the audit team, Ouagadougou remained calm on the surface. Government buildings continued their normal routines. Citizens went about their daily lives. Markets stayed busy, and the familiar sounds of the city filled the air. But inside several quiet offices, something very different was happening. 21 economists and financial specialists had begun examining the financial history of Burkina Faso. Their task was not simple. They were asked to review every major international loan agreement signed between 2005 and 2025. 20 years of financial commitments, 20 years of decisions made by different governments under different circumstances. And within those 20 years, they discovered a total of 52 loan contracts that required detailed analysis. 52. At first glance, that number did not seem extraordinary. For many nations, development projects often involve multiple financial partnerships. Loans may come from international financial institutions, regional banks, or development programs designed to support infrastructure and economic growth. But when the team began studying the contracts one by one, they realized something important. Each agreement was connected to a specific vision for development. Some loans had been approved to expand national energy production. Others supported transportation networks intended to connect rural communities with urban markets. Several were tied to mining infrastructure designed to help Burkina Faso benefit more from its natural resources. On paper, these projects reflected ambition. They represented a country seeking to modernize and strengthen its economy. But reviewing 52 agreements required more than reading contracts. The audit team had to understand the full life cycle of each project. How much money had been borrowed, what conditions were attached to the loan, how the funds were allocated, and most importantly, what results had actually been achieved. The work was slow and methodical. Documents filled large tables. Some contracts were hundreds of pages long. They contained legal language, repayment structures, interest conditions, and technical descriptions of development goals. Every line had to be examined, every clause understood. Because financial agreements are often complex, small details hidden inside long contracts can shape how repayment obligations evolve over many years. The team divided their responsibilities. Some specialists focused on energy-related projects. Others examined transportation agreements. Another group studied loans connected to mining and natural resource development. Several analysts worked specifically on the financial structures of the contracts themselves, studying how interest rates and repayment schedules were organized. As the days passed, patterns began to appear. Many of the agreements shared similar structures. Loans were approved to support infrastructure development. Funds were released in stages depending on project progress. Repayment schedules extended over many years. In theory, these arrangements allowed developing nations to invest in major projects without needing immediate capital. But theory and reality do not always move together. So the audit team began comparing the contracts with the real progress of the projects. And that is when the questions started to deepen. Some projects appeared to have advanced exactly as planned. Road networks had been expanded in certain regions, energy facilities had improved electricity supply in some areas, agricultural programs had helped farmers access better equipment and markets. These examples reminded the team that development loans are not automatically harmful. Many of them genuinely support progress, but other projects were more difficult to evaluate. Construction delays appeared in some cases. Budgets had increased beyond original estimates in others, and in several instances, the project results were less visible than expected when compared to the amount of money borrowed. The team did not jump to conclusions. Their job was not to accuse anyone. Their job was to understand the facts. So they continued reviewing documents carefully. Each loan agreement was placed within a timeline. When it was signed, how much money was approved, what development goals it promised, and how the repayment schedule affected the national budget. As they built this timeline, something became increasingly clear. Burkina Faso had entered many loan agreements over the years with the hope that each project would contribute to long-term economic growth. But those agreements had accumulated gradually, like layers. Each loan added another financial obligation. Each repayment schedule overlapped with others. And over time, the combined weight of these obligations had grown larger than most people realized. When viewed individually, each agreement appeared manageable. But when viewed together, the financial structure became far more complex. 52 agreements meant 52 repayment schedules, 52 sets of financial conditions, 52 commitments shaping the future budget of the country. And as the audit team continued their analysis, they discovered something else. Not all development projects had progressed in the same way. Some had experienced significant cost increases. Others had taken far longer than expected to complete. And a few projects remained unfinished even after substantial funds had already been committed. At this stage, the team did not yet present conclusions. They were still gathering evidence. But the patterns they were seeing raised important questions. Were the cost increases normal for projects of this scale? Were the delays the result of logistical challenges? Or did the structure of some agreements create pressures that made projects more difficult to complete efficiently? Answering those questions required deeper investigation. The audit team began comparing project budgets with actual spending records. They examined construction timelines. They studied reports submitted by project managers and government agencies. Slowly, the financial picture became clearer, and with that clarity came the first serious concerns. Some projects had experienced cost overruns of more than 45%. Several others had fallen significantly behind schedule. These findings did not yet represent the final report, but they were important warning signs. Signs that the development path Burkina Faso had followed for many years might need careful reconsideration. When the team eventually compiled their preliminary findings, they realized that the real story was not simply about debt. It was about the effectiveness of the projects connected to that debt. If borrowed money builds strong infrastructure and economic growth, repayment can become manageable. But if projects struggle, the financial burden remains. And that burden can shape a nation's future for decades. The next stage of the audit would focus precisely on this issue. The team would analyze the performance of the projects themselves. Which ones succeeded? Which ones struggled? And why? Because behind every loan agreement lies a project, and behind every project lies a promise made to the people. Understanding whether those promises were fulfilled would become the most important part of the investigation. As the audit team continued its work, the pace inside those quiet offices in Ouagadougou did not slow down. Day after day, the 21 specialists examined documents, project reports, and financial statements connected to the 52 international loan agreements. What had started as a simple review of contracts was now becoming something deeper. They were no longer just studying the loans themselves. They were studying the reality of the projects those loans were meant to create. Because every financial agreement carried a promise. A promise that borrowed money would be transformed into real progress. New roads, reliable electricity, better transportation networks, economic growth. The audit team understood that development projects are rarely perfect. Construction delays can occur. Budgets sometimes increase due to unexpected technical challenges. Even well-managed programs face obstacles. But when the specialists began comparing the original project plans with the actual outcomes, certain patterns became difficult to ignore. One of the first patterns involved cost increases. Several projects had required significantly more funding than originally planned. The team carefully compared the original budgets with the final or current expenditures recorded in government reports. After reviewing the numbers, they reached an early finding. 13 of the projects had experienced cost overruns greater than 45%. In other words, the final costs had risen to nearly half again, as much as the initial estimates. This kind of increase does not automatically mean wrongdoing. Large infrastructure projects often face unexpected expenses. Changes in material prices, supply chain disruptions, or new engineering challenges can affect construction budgets. But when cost increases appear across multiple projects, it raises an important question. Were the original estimates realistic, or had the true cost been underestimated from the beginning? The team did not assume the answer. They simply documented the numbers. The second pattern involved project timelines. Several development programs had taken longer to complete than expected. 9 of the projects were significantly behind schedule compared with the original plans described in the loan agreements. Some were delayed by months, others by years. These delays carried financial consequences. Loan repayment schedules often begin long before a project produces the economic benefits it was designed to create. For example, if a transportation project is intended to increase trade and commerce, its success depends on the road actually being completed and used by businesses and communities. But if construction takes longer than expected, the economic benefits are delayed. Meanwhile, the repayment obligations remain. The audit team understood that this timing problem could place additional strain on the national budget. Burkina Faso might begin repaying loans even before the projects connected to those loans had generated meaningful economic returns. A third pattern also emerged during the investigation. Several projects showed a heavy dependence on continued external financing. In other words, they required additional funding beyond the original loans to continue progressing. This created a complicated situation. If new funds were not secured, some projects risked slowing down or stopping entirely. But if additional borrowing was required to finish them, the total national debt would increase even further. The team carefully documented these situations. Again, they avoided speculation. Their responsibility was to present evidence, and the evidence was clear. Some projects were successful and progressing well, but others had faced significant financial and logistical challenges. As the days passed, the specialists organized their findings into detailed reports. Charts were created to show how project budgets had changed over time. Timelines illustrated how construction schedules had shifted. Tables compared the original loan agreements with the current financial obligations connected to those projects. Each piece of information helped clarify the overall picture. By the time the preliminary analysis was nearly complete, the audit team had assembled a large body of evidence. They were now ready to summarize what they had discovered. The report they prepared was not small. It was more than 100 pages long. Page after page described the financial structures of the loans, the development goals attached to each agreement, and the real outcomes of the projects funded by those loans. But the most important part of the report was not the numbers themselves. It was the conclusion that began to emerge from them. Burkina Faso had not simply borrowed money. It had built an entire development strategy around borrowing. For many years, international loans had been used as a primary tool for financing infrastructure and economic programs. Some of those programs had succeeded, but others had encountered serious difficulties. And when those difficulties combined with rising debt obligations, the financial pressure on the national budget became increasingly visible. 38% of the government's budget already went toward debt repayment, and future obligations would continue for many years. The audit team understood that their findings carried serious implications. They were not claiming that borrowing was inherently wrong. They were not accusing any particular institution or administration. They were simply presenting a reality. If Burkina Faso wished to protect its long-term economic independence, it needed to examine its development strategy carefully. Loans can support growth, but too much dependence on external borrowing can gradually limit a nation's financial freedom. Once the team finished compiling the report, they prepared to present their findings to the government. The document contained approximately 120 pages of analysis. It described the 52 loan agreements. It summarized the performance of the projects, and it explained the financial pressures created by the accumulated debt. The next step would be to bring those findings directly to me, and to the Economic Council responsible for advising the government. That presentation would take place later the same day, on the afternoon of March 10, 2026. It would be the first time the full picture of Burkina Faso's financial commitments was laid out in a single document, and it would confirm something I had begun to suspect during that quiet night of prayer. The issue facing our nation was not just about numbers. It was about the path we had chosen for development, and whether that path truly led toward independence, or toward something else. By the afternoon of that same day, the air in Ouagadougou had grown warmer. Sunlight pressed down on the city's rooftops, and the busy movement of the morning had slowed into the quieter rhythm of midday. But inside the presidential offices, there was no sense of slowing down. The audit team had completed their preliminary report. After days of careful analysis, the 21 specialists gathered their findings into a single document. It was not a short summary. The report extended across 120 pages. Every section of the document described a part of Burkina Faso's financial story. The 52 loan agreements, the development projects linked to those loans, the repayment structures shaping the national budget, and the patterns that had begun to appear when all those pieces were studied together. That afternoon, several members of the audit team entered the meeting room carrying thick folders. I remember noticing how heavy those folders looked, not only because of the number of pages inside them, but because of what those pages represented. 2 decades of economic decisions, 2 decades of hopes for development, 2 decades of commitments made on behalf of the nation. The room was quieter than usual. Present at the meeting were several members of the Economic Council, senior government officials, and representatives from financial ministries. Each person received a copy of the report. When the lead economist began speaking, his tone was measured and calm. There was no drama in his voice, just careful explanation. He began by describing the scope of the review. The team had examined 52 international loan agreements signed between 2005 and 2025. These agreements involved development funding connected to energy infrastructure, transportation networks, mining programs, and other national development initiatives. Each contract had been studied individually. Then all of them had been analyzed together to understand their combined financial impact. The economist turned the page of the report and continued. He explained that some projects funded by these loans had delivered measurable progress. Certain roads had improved transportation between regions. Some energy programs had increased electricity availability. These successes were important to recognize. But the report also described challenges. 13 projects had experienced cost overruns greater than 45%. 9 projects had fallen significantly behind schedule. Several initiatives required continued external funding to maintain progress. These facts had already been discussed during the audit process, but hearing them summarized in a formal report gave them new weight. The economist then explained the broader financial picture. When all 52 loan agreements were combined, they created a complex structure of repayment obligations stretching many years into the future. Each loan had its own timeline, its own interest conditions, its own repayment schedule, but together they placed increasing pressure on the national budget. The report confirmed the figure we had already discussed earlier that day. Approximately 38% of the government budget in the year 2025 had been allocated to debt repayment and interest. And according to financial projections, those obligations would continue for many years unless the country changed its approach to borrowing and development. As the presentation continued, the economist carefully avoided making political statements. He was not there to accuse anyone. His task was simply to present the evidence. But the evidence itself spoke clearly. Burkina Faso had spent many years pursuing development through international borrowing. Some projects had succeeded, others had struggled. But regardless of those outcomes, the debt remained, and that debt required repayment. The report included several financial projections showing how repayment obligations might evolve over the next decade if current policies remained unchanged. The charts revealed something important. If borrowing continued at the same pace, while existing repayment schedules remained in place, the national budget could face even greater pressure in the future. This did not mean financial collapse, but it did mean reduced flexibility, less room for investment in public services, less freedom in shaping national economic policy. In other words, the financial decisions of the past were already influencing the options available for the future. As I listened to the presentation, I found myself remembering the verse from Proverbs that had stayed with me the night before. The borrower is servant to the lender. The report did not claim that Burkina Faso had lost its independence, but it did show how financial dependence can gradually grow, not through a single dramatic event, but through many small decisions made over many years. When the economists finished presenting the main findings, the room remained quiet for a moment. Several council members turned pages of the report again, reviewing certain sections more carefully. Finally, I asked a question. What is the most important conclusion of this analysis? The economist paused before answering. Then he spoke with careful clarity. The most important conclusion, Mr. President, is that Burkina Faso must understand the long-term consequences of its borrowing strategy. The loans themselves are not necessarily the problem. The problem is when borrowing becomes the central tool for development without sufficient evaluation of its long-term impact. His answer was direct and honest. It was not an accusation against international institutions. It was not a criticism of previous governments. It was simply a warning about sustainability. Development must create strength, not dependency. The meeting continued for several more hours. Members of the Economic Council asked detailed questions about the contracts, the project outcomes, and the financial projections described in the report. The audit team answered each question carefully. When the meeting finally ended, everyone in the room understood something important. Burkina Faso had reached a moment of reflection. The country could continue along the same financial path, or it could pause, examine the lessons revealed by the audit, and begin searching for new approaches to development. Later that evening, another important moment awaited. I would stand before the National Assembly in Ouagadougou and speak openly about what we had learned, not as an act of confrontation, but as an invitation to think carefully about the future of our nation, and perhaps about the future of economic independence across Africa, because the story we had uncovered was not only about Burkina Faso. Many countries face similar questions. Questions about debt, questions about development, questions about the balance between cooperation and independence. Those questions would form the heart of the message I shared that night. By the time evening arrived in Ouagadougou, the air had cooled slightly. The long heat of the afternoon had faded, and the lights of the city began to glow across the streets and buildings. Government vehicles moved slowly through the capital as officials prepared for the evening session of the National Assembly. That night carried a different weight. Throughout the day, I had listened carefully to the findings presented in the 120-page report. The evidence was clear, but the meaning of that evidence needed to be explained to the nation. Leadership sometimes requires quiet decisions behind closed doors, but at other times leadership requires speaking openly. I believe this was one of those moments. The National Assembly building in Ouagadougou stood illuminated as members of parliament gathered inside the chamber. Representatives from different regions of the country took their seats. Some spoke quietly among themselves while others reviewed documents placed before them. When I entered the hall, the atmosphere shifted slightly, not tense, but attentive. Everyone knew the meeting had been called with unusual urgency. After the formal proceedings began, I stood to address the assembly. For a brief moment, I looked across the room. These men and women represented the people of Burkina Faso. Farmers, teachers, soldiers, merchants, families across the nation had placed their hopes in the decisions made inside that chamber. So I spoke carefully. I did not begin with accusations. I did not speak with anger. Instead, I began with a simple truth. Every nation seeks development. Every government hopes to improve the lives of its citizens through better infrastructure, stronger economies, and greater opportunity. Burkina Faso has pursued that goal for many years. Like many developing countries, we have partnered with international financial institutions to support projects in energy, transportation, agriculture, and natural resources. These partnerships were created with the intention of progress, and some of them have indeed contributed to improvements. But development must always be examined honestly, because the true measure of progress is not the number of agreements signed. It is the long-term strength those agreements create. I then explained the work that had taken place earlier that day. A team of 21 economic specialists had conducted a detailed review of major international loan agreements signed over the past 2 decades. They had examined 52 financial contracts. They had analyzed the development projects connected to those agreements, and they had studied the long-term financial impact those loans placed upon the national budget. Members of the assembly listened carefully. Many of them had already heard discussions about rising national debt, but few had seen the full picture gathered in one place. I continued. The audit report revealed both progress and challenges. Some development projects had produced tangible results. Road networks had expanded. Energy systems had improved in certain areas. Agricultural initiatives had helped strengthen local production. These achievements deserved recognition, but the report also showed difficulties. Several projects had experienced large cost increases. Others had taken far longer to complete than expected. And together, the 52 loan agreements had created a complex structure of repayment obligations. Those obligations now required approximately 38% of the national budget to be dedicated to debt repayment and interest. When that number was spoken aloud inside the chamber, a quiet murmur moved through the room. 38%, nearly 2/5 of government spending. That reality could not be ignored. I paused briefly before continuing. Then I shared something more personal. I told the assembly about the quiet moment of reflection that had occurred earlier that morning. The moment when I had been reading the book of Proverbs, and the verse that had remained in my mind, "The borrower is servant to the lender." I explained that those words did not represent hostility toward international cooperation. Burkina Faso respects partnerships. We recognize that cooperation between nations can produce valuable progress. But the verse from Proverbs offered a reminder. Debt carries influence. And when borrowing becomes the primary path to development, a nation must examine carefully whether it is strengthening its independence or slowly weakening it. The purpose of the audit was not to reject international cooperation. It was to understand our situation clearly, because a nation that understands its finances can make wiser decisions about its future. I then spoke about the next steps. Burkina Faso would begin reviewing its development strategy with greater attention to economic independence. We would continue cooperating with international partners when projects truly serve the interests of our people. But we would also explore ways to strengthen domestic investment, regional partnerships, and internal economic growth. Development must not only build roads and infrastructure, it must build freedom. Freedom to make national decisions without excessive financial pressure. Freedom to invest in the needs of our citizens. Freedom to shape our future according to our own priorities. As I finished speaking, the chamber remained quiet for several seconds. Then discussion began. Some representatives asked questions about the audit process. Others wanted more details about the specific projects mentioned in the report. Several members expressed support for the idea of reviewing the country's long-term development strategy. The conversation that followed was thoughtful and serious. No one in the room believed the situation could be solved overnight. Debt accumulated over decades cannot disappear in a single decision, but awareness is the first step toward change. That evening, the National Assembly did not vote on new laws. It did something more important. It began a national conversation, a conversation about how Burkina Faso could pursue development while protecting its long-term economic independence. But the message I shared that night was not only intended for our parliament. As I spoke, I was also thinking about something larger, the future of Africa. Because many nations across the continent face similar questions. Questions about development, questions about borrowing, questions about the balance between partnership and independence. And those questions would become the heart of the message I wanted to share beyond the walls of the National Assembly. A message not only for Burkina Faso, but for the entire African continent. After leaving the National Assembly that evening, the city of Ouagadougou felt unusually quiet to me. Not because the streets were empty. Life continued as it always does in the capital. Cars moved through intersections, small restaurants remained open, families gathered together in homes across the city. But inside my thoughts, there was a deep sense of reflection. The events of that day had revealed something important about the economic path Burkina Faso had followed for many years. And as I considered those findings, I realized that our story was not unique. Across Africa, many nations share similar experiences. Many governments have pursued development through international loans. Roads have been built, power plants have been constructed. Economic programs have been launched with the help of external funding. Some of these efforts have produced real progress, but many African countries are also carrying growing levels of international debt. And with that debt comes responsibility. Responsibility to repay what has been borrowed. Responsibility to manage national finances carefully. And responsibility to ensure that the decisions made today do not burden future generations unnecessarily. As I reflected on these ideas, the verse from the book of Proverbs returned again to my mind. The borrower is servant to the lender. It is a simple sentence, yet its wisdom reaches across centuries. Debt itself is not evil. Many individuals borrow money to build homes, start businesses, or educate their children. Nations sometimes borrow funds to build infrastructure and stimulate economic growth. But wisdom lies in understanding the balance. Borrowing should strengthen freedom, not weaken it. For Africa, this balance carries special meaning. Our continent has experienced many forms of external influence throughout history. Colonial systems once controlled our land and resources. Later, economic structures sometimes continued patterns of dependence. Because of this history, economic independence is more than a financial concept. It is part of dignity, it is part of sovereignty, and it is part of the responsibility leaders hold toward their people. The audit we conducted in Burkina Faso did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. It did not reject international cooperation. Instead, it asked an important question. Are we building development in a way that strengthens our independence? Or are we creating systems that quietly reduce our freedom to make our own decisions? These questions are not easy to answer. They require careful study of financial agreements, economic policies, and long-term national priorities. But asking the question is already a step toward wisdom. Africa is a continent rich in resources, culture, creativity, and faith. Our people are resilient. Our history is filled with examples of communities overcoming enormous challenges with determination and courage. Because of that strength, I believe Africa has the ability to shape its economic future more deliberately. This does not mean turning away from the world. Cooperation between nations is valuable. Partnerships can bring knowledge, investment, and technological progress. But cooperation should always exist alongside self-reliance. African nations must carefully evaluate the financial agreements they enter. They must study the conditions attached to international loans. They must ensure that development projects produce real and lasting economic benefits. And they must invest in strengthening their own internal economies. Agriculture, local industries, regional trade between African countries, education and innovation. These areas can build lasting strength without relying entirely on external borrowing. Faith also plays an important role in this process. Across Africa, millions of people believe deeply in God. Churches and communities pray regularly for guidance, for justice, and for wisdom among leaders. Faith reminds us that leadership is not only about power, it is about responsibility before God and before the people we serve. When I read the words from Proverbs that night, I did not interpret them as a command to reject all financial cooperation. Instead, I saw them as a reminder to examine carefully the choices we make, a reminder that freedom requires vigilance, and a reminder that wisdom often comes from simple truths spoken long ago. As African nations continue pursuing development, I hope more leaders will take time to reflect on these principles, to ask difficult questions, to study the long-term consequences of economic decisions, and to ensure that progress does not come at the cost of independence. The future of Africa will not be determined by a single policy or a single agreement. It will be shaped by thousands of decisions made by leaders, communities, and citizens across the continent. If those decisions are guided by wisdom, faith, and responsibility, then Africa's future can be strong and independent. And that hope is not only for Africa, it is for the entire world. Because a world where nations cooperate with mutual respect rather than dependence is a world where peace and prosperity have a greater chance to grow. That was the message I carried in my heart after the events of March 10th, 2026. A message born from careful study, from prayer, and from a desire to see my country and my continent walk a path of dignity and wisdom. When I look back on the events of that day, I do not see a dramatic confrontation. I see a moment of awakening, a quiet moment when a nation paused to examine the direction of its future. Leadership sometimes involves bold speeches and public decisions, but more often it begins with something simpler. It begins with asking honest questions. On the morning of March 10th, 2026, those questions led our government to look carefully at the financial path Burkina Faso had followed for many years. What we discovered was not a scandal. It was something more subtle, a pattern. Over 2 decades, our nation had signed many agreements with international financial institutions. Some of those agreements helped build infrastructure. Some supported development projects that improved the lives of our citizens. But at the same time, those agreements created obligations that gradually grew larger, obligations that required increasing portions of our national budget to repay loans and interest. 38% of government spending dedicated to debt repayment is not just a financial statistic. It is a reminder that every economic decision carries consequences. Some consequences appear immediately. Others take years to reveal themselves. That day taught me something important about leadership. A nation must not only pursue development, it must pursue wise development. Development that strengthens independence. Development that respects the future. Development that allows a country to stand with dignity among other nations. For Burkina Faso, the journey toward that kind of development is still unfolding. There are no simple solutions. Debt accumulated over many years cannot disappear in a single moment. Infrastructure projects require time, economic systems require patience, but awareness changes everything. When a nation understands its financial position clearly, it gains the ability to make better choices. Choices that protect the next generation. Choices that build strength instead of dependence. My hope is that Burkina Faso continues walking a path of responsibility. A path where our leaders examine agreements carefully. A path where development projects are evaluated not only by their promises, but by their real outcomes. And a path where faith remains a guiding force. Because faith reminds us that leadership is not only about numbers and policies, it is also about conscience. It is about remembering that every decision made by a government affects real human lives. Children attending school, farmers working the land, families praying for a better future. When leaders forget those people, power becomes empty. But when leaders remember them, decisions begin to carry deeper meaning. I also hope that the message from our experience reaches beyond Burkina Faso. Africa is a continent filled with potential. Our people are creative, resilient, and determined. Our land holds immense resources, and our cultures carry wisdom passed down through generations. If African nations continue strengthening cooperation among themselves while carefully managing international partnerships, the continent can build a future based on dignity and self-reliance. Not isolation, but balanced cooperation, not dependence, but partnership built on respect. And perhaps the lesson that guided my thinking that night will also speak to others. The words from Proverbs remain as true today as they were centuries ago. The borrower is servant to the lender. This sentence is not meant to inspire fear. It is meant to inspire wisdom. It reminds individuals and nations alike to think carefully before placing themselves under obligations that may shape their future. It encourages responsibility, and it invites reflection. Sometimes the most powerful guidance does not come from complex economic theories. Sometimes it comes from simple truths written long ago. As I finish sharing this story, my hope is not to persuade anyone toward a particular political position. My hope is much simpler. I hope that people everywhere continue seeking truth. I hope leaders remember the responsibility placed upon them. And I hope that nations pursue development with wisdom, integrity, and faith. Because when decisions are guided by those values, the future becomes brighter for everyone. For Burkina Faso, for Africa, and for the world. May peace grow where there is conflict. May wisdom guide those who lead. And may every nation remember that true strength comes not only from wealth or power, but from justice, responsibility, and faith. If these reflections have given you something to think about, I invite you to share your thoughts with others. Conversations like these help people understand the challenges and hopes shaping our world today. And if you wish to continue hearing stories that explore leadership, faith, and the future of nations, you are welcome to remain part of this growing community. Because understanding begins when people listen, reflect, and speak with honesty. Allow me to end with a simple affirmation. I speak not as a distant figure in history. I speak as a servant of my people, a man who has reflected deeply on the responsibilities of leadership and the wisdom that faith can offer. And so I say this with clarity. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words come from truth. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words come from truth. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words come from truth.